Part 1. The Stained Silence. Behind the moss-covered stones of a forgotten monastery, where the candlelight flickers too faintly to chase away the dark, there lies a silence, thick, unmoving, and stained. It is the kind of silence that doesn't come from peace, but from guilt. A silence that has seen too much, heard too much, buried too much. They called this place a house of God, but on certain nights, especially when the moon turned red and full, it felt more like a tomb, not of bodies, but of secrets. There were whispers, soft as dying prayers, footsteps in the corridors when no one should have been awake, and sometimes, just sometimes, a shadow would move across the stained glass long after the candles were out. This was not the kind of church one entered to find salvation. It was the kind one entered to forget. And somewhere, in the lowest chamber beneath the altar, buried beneath 5 layers of stone and shame, was a sealed box. No cross, no scripture. Only one thing carved on the lid, with the edge of a blood-soaked dagger. Sanguis est lux. Blood is the light. Inside that box, a diary, written in crimson ink. Its first line read, "Blood is life, but sometimes life must be hidden beneath the robes of faith." That was the beginning. The first thread unraveling a forbidden tapestry that had been stitched with centuries of lies, rituals, and silent screams. They were called the Crimson Fathers, men who had once taken vows of chastity, humility, obedience, and then in the dark took something else. They took blood. Not for violence, not even for power, but for eternity. They believed that the blood of a believer taken with ritual could grant more than life. It could grant memory, a passage into the divine, a doorway to forbidden knowledge. This wasn't theology. It was alchemy laced with faith, a sacred heresy. And like all good heresies, it hid in plain sight. That's the terrifying part, isn't it? We imagine vampires lurking in forests, underneath castles, wearing fangs and feeding in the dark. But what if one stood before you, in robes of white and gold, holding a chalice and whispering Latin prayers? What if the real monsters never needed to hide, because faith made us blonde, and trust made them ours? The Crimson Cross was not just a symbol, it was a system, a hidden order buried within the church itself. And like all hidden things, it began to rot. But the story doesn't begin with blood. It begins with belief, the kind of belief that makes people do unthinkable things in the name of light. Part 2. The First Sacrament. Before the rituals, before the chalice dripped crimson, there was a boy, barefoot, wide-eyed, and chosen. His name was Tomas. The priests had found him abandoned at the threshold of the abbey on a storm-swollen night, his tiny frame wrapped in cloth, soaked through with rain and something darker. They named him after the doubting apostle, but Tomas never doubted. He was obedient, quiet, too quiet. He grew up among whispers. Not the kind exchanged between monks, but the whispers that echo inside stone walls, when no mouths are moving. The whispers that drift like incense, sweet and smoky, too close to the ear. At age 12, Tomas was brought before Father Corvinus, the head of the Crimson Fathers, a man with eyes the color of rusted iron and a voice like wet parchment. Corvinus asked only one question: would you bleed for the light? Tomas didn't hesitate. He nodded, and the first sacrament began. In the hidden chapel beneath the chapel, where no candle could ever truly hold its flame, Tomas was bathed, robed, and led barefoot into the circle of bone. It was a place older than the abbey itself, older than scripture. Skulls lined the stone, arranged in silent prayer. In the centers to the font, carved from a single block of obsidian, filled not with water, but blood, thick, dark, and still warm. Corvinus dipped a silver chalice into it. He didn't drink. Instead, he painted a cross onto Tomas's chest, a cross not of ash, but of blood. Then, with a blade kissed by candlelight, he pressed the tip against Tomas's palm and whispered, "Let the light enter you." As Tomas's blood joined the font, the candles in the chamber flickered, though no wind blew. In that moment, the boy felt something seep into his bones, a coldness wrapped in warmth, a voice not heard, but known. He would never be alone again. That was the first sacrament, not of bread, not of wine, but of memory and marrow. The Crimson Fathers believed that each drop of blood carried more than life. It carried lineage. To drink was to remember, to mark was to inherit. And Tomas, he was no longer just a boy, he was a vessel. Each year on the night of his finding, the ritual repeated, the chalice deeper, the blood older, until his veins no longer felt his own. By 17, he could speak Latin he was never taught. By 20, he dreamed the deaths of people he never knew. And by 25, he stopped aging altogether. What they had created was not a man, not even a vampire in the traditional sense. He was a walking reliquary, a host of spirits, a breathing archive of sacrificial memory. They called him Lux Vivens, the living light. But light, when locked in darkness too long, doesn't purify. It blinds. And in the blind silence of his nights, he began to hear things again, voices in the walls. Only now, they had names, ages, last prayers. They weren't whispers anymore. They were screams. You see, belief can shape reality, but belief corrupted, twists it. The Crimson Fathers believed they were preserving faith, but in truth, they were hoarding death. And Tomas, he was the vault. He never left the monastery, not because he was forbidden, but because he feared what he might do if he did. He had become a keeper of sins, but had no one to confess to. No God answered, no absolution came, only the endless echo of the same question. Would you bleed for the light?
Part 3. The Judas Room. Every monastery has a room that's never shown on the tour. Not locked, but hidden. Its door looks no different from the others. Aged oak, iron hinges, carved with the same Latin benedictions. But behind it, there are no hymns, only judgment. They called it the Judas Room. Not because Judas died there, but because it was built for those who once kissed holiness, then bit the neck of the sacred. The Crimson Fathers did not forgive betrayal. Not because they feared rebellion, but because they feared exposure. When a priest began to question the rituals, when doubt crawled into his prayers like mildew into bread, he was taken, not punished in the open, not excommunicated, not even killed. He was erased. In the Judas Room, they performed a ritual no scripture ever mentioned, the red reversal. They didn't draw blood to preserve it. They drew it to extinguish memory. Not just the priest's own, but the collective memory he had joined. Thomas was often made to watch, not by choice, but by command. "You are the vessel," Corvinus would say, his fingers cold as stone resting on Thomas's shoulder. "You must witness the sealing." Inside the Judas Room, the air didn't move. The priests would chant in reverse Latin, backward psalms that no soul could survive hearing without unraveling. And then, the blade, not to kill, but to divide the soul from its story. Thomas saw men scream without mouths moving, eyes turned inward, and blood, seeping not from skin, but from memory. One night, a man named Father Adrian was brought in. He had been one of the oldest Crimson Fathers, wise, gentle. He used to give Thomas dried figs and warm milk. But he had whispered a forbidden sentence during evening prayer. What if the light is not God, but hunger? They heard it. They always did. And that night, Thomas watched as Adrian was laid on the altar, not of gold, but of bone. The chant began. The chalice filled. Adrian didn't scream. He sang. A lullaby Thomas remembered from his childhood, but had never told anyone. Then, silence. And when Thomas looked into the chalice, It was empty, not a drop, not a trace. Not because Adrian's blood had vanished, but because it had never existed. He was erased from the vessel, from the order, from memory itself. Thomas began to fear the silence more than the screams, because screams meant resistance, but silence meant agreement. And the Judas room began to haunt his dreams. He would wake up with dried blood on his palms, yet no wounds. Visions of Adrian smiling through hollow eyes, humming lullabies in a language the world had forgotten. There is a room in every soul where we store the people we have failed. For Thomas, the Judas room was no longer a place. It was inside him. Every step he took echoed the guilt of those who were sealed away. Every breath carried their lost memories. He was no longer just a vessel. He was a vault of ghosts.
Part 4. The Crimson Psalm. It began with a drop. Just one. Sliding down the inner wall of the monastery's bell tower, where no blood had ever flown and no birds had ever perched. Thomas noticed it during morning prayer. The bell rang hollow, too hollow. He looked up, and there it was, a smear of red tracing the stone like a signature. But no one else saw it. Not Corvinus, not the other fathers. To them, the bell tolled as always. To Thomas, it wept. That night, it returned. Not the drop, but the sound. A low hum. Almost a chant, but with no words. Just vibration, like bones remembering a song they were never taught. Thomas lay in his chamber, eyes wide open, breath shallow. The humming grew louder, spiraling like incense smoke in reverse. And then, a voice. Soft, female, ancient. She did not call him by name. She called him by function. My archivist, my prison. And then from the dark, sing what they tried to silence. He woke with blood on his tongue. By dawn, Thomas had written it. An entire psalm. 12 verses. No ink. Just blood from his own fingertips smudged onto the parchment like a blind man painting fire. He didn't remember writing it, but he could feel it pulsing in his chest like a second heart. And when he read it aloud, alone, the shadows listened. Candles leaned, walls exhaled dust, and for a moment, even the stained glass seemed to tremble. He brought it to Corvinus. A mistake. The older man read only the first line. The lamb that drinks the shepherd's blood sees God backwards. His face turned ashen. Without a word, Corvinus struck the parchment from Thomas's hands. You will burn this. But the parchment didn't burn. They tried. Oil, ash, salt. Even flame from the eternal candle, kept lit since the abbey's founding. The crimson psalm would not consume. It sang, low and terrible, vibrating across the chamber like the groan of old wood under the weight of centuries. And then Thomas spoke. What if it is not I who must burn, but this place? For the first time, Corvinus looked afraid. The Crimson Fathers convened, not to debate, to contain. They sealed Thomas beneath the monastery, in the vault of relics, where the bones of heretics were stored not to rot, but to suffocate. They left him there. No food, no light, only the psalm. And it grew louder. Not outside, inside. 12 verses became 40. Then 40, and Thomas sang. Not in voice, but in blood. He etched the walls with it, carved it into stone with fingernails broken to the quick. Not to escape, to remember. Each verse peeled away a lie. Each line unwrapped a falsehood like cloth from a wound too long dressed. Until finally, on the 7th night, the wall cracked. Not from force, but from truth. And from within the wall, a whisper. Not female this time, but his own voice speaking to him from behind the stone. You were never their vessel. You were always their undoing. Thomas emerged from the vault of relics not as a man, but as a scripture made flesh. He carried the crimson psalm not in his hands, but in his veins, and the abbey would never be the same again.
Part 5. The Night the Bells Bled. The Crimson Psalm was never meant to be heard, but on the 13th night, Thomas sang it aloud. Not in secret, not in whispers, but in the heart of the chapel, under the crucifix that had watched centuries of silent sins. He did not need parchment. He bled the verses through his skin, each drop rising like steam from the cold floor. And then he began. At first, the fathers ignored it. A man murmuring in the chapel was not uncommon. But as his voice rose, steady, measured, filled with echoes that didn't belong in his throat, they came. Corvinus arrived first, expecting madness. What he saw was memory incarnate. Thomas stood barefoot, robes torn, eyes closed. His lips moved with deliberate reverence, as if unweaving creation. And the chandeliers trembled. The walls began to sweat. Blood seeped from the mortar between stones, just thin lines at first, like tears, but then faster, thicker. The carved eyes of saints on the fresco began to bleed. And from the bell tower, a sound not heard in centuries. The bell cracked, not from time, from conviction. It screamed across the valley like a soul being torn in half. The villagers below fell to their knees, not in faith, but in fear. Something ancient was being remembered. Corvinus tried to stop him. He shouted, cursed, even drew the silver blade once used in the Judas room. But Thomas did not flinch. He turned slowly, calmly, and said, I know who the Lamb truly was. The blade dropped. The air thickened, and from the ceiling dropped blood, not downward, but up. The other Crimson Fathers gathered, their faces pale, their chants confused. Each tried to summon the old rites, but their voices faltered, their tongues twisted, because the psalm was older than Latin, older than scripture, older than their entire idea of holiness. It was the truth beneath the lies, and the chapel, once a sanctuary of order, now pulsed with unforgiving remembrance. The altar cracked, not from flame or quake, but from judgment, and beneath it bones, not relics, children. Hundreds of small bones, the price of immortality. The blood they had claimed was sacred was stolen. The truth lay bare, and Thomas did not accuse. He simply sang, each verse a mirror, each line a confession. The fathers fell, one by one, not by wrath, but by recognition. They saw themselves in the psalm, and it broke them. When silence returned, Thomas stood alone, not triumphant, not vengeful, just still. The bell no longer rang, it bled, and the chapel, for the first time in centuries, was honest. No saints, no salvation, only memory. They say that night rewrote the monastery. Visitors report feeling dizzy near the old altar. Some say the walls still hum with blood song, and others claim they've heard a lullaby, sung in reverse. But none speak of Thomas, because he is no longer a man. He is a verse that cannot be forgotten, a bell that cannot be unrung, a truth that bleeds through stone.
Part 6. Scripture of the Undying. They buried the monastery's name. Maps erased it. Records blurred it. Even Rome, in its velvet silence, called it merely the anomaly. But the song remained. Thomas carried it in his bloodstream. A psalm with no end. A scripture written not by man, but by what man betrayed. He wandered. From Carpathian ruins to desert catacombs, following whispers older than parchment. Everywhere he went, libraries trembled. Candles flickered before he entered. Walls perspired with forgotten ink. He wasn't hunting. He was remembering. In a hidden chapel, carved inside a cave of obsidian, deep beneath the sands of Cappadocia, Thomas found it. A mirror, but not of glass,
of bone. Polished vertebrae fused with centuries of dried blood, shaped into a circle. As he looked, it didn't reflect him. It showed 12 men, cloaked in crimson, chanting in reverse. Behind them, an altar. Above it, a boy, alive, afraid, and silent. Then, darkness. Thomas knelt before it. He asked, "What did we build this on?" The bone mirror replied, not with sound, but vision. The truth, the Crimson Fathers were not protectors of holy blood. They were the architects of suppression. They had discovered an ancient covenant, one that claimed humanity was never meant to bleed as punishment, but to bleed as passage. The blood is not the curse, the vision whispered. It is the doorway. He saw then a different church, one that sang in harmony with the earth's pulse, a belief that blood was not sin, but seed, that when spilled freely, willingly, it opened visions, connected minds, healed grief. But it was too wild, too equal, too free. And so it was buried, not with shovels, but with scripture. The Crimson Fathers wrote the inverse of that truth, that blood was crime, that to shed it was to sin, that salvation lay in silence. They created guilt and sold redemption. Thomas now understood the psalm he carried was not his. It was a fragment of the original Blood Testament, a sacred song silenced centuries ago. He was not its prophet, he was its echo. And now it wanted to be whole. In the caves, Thomas carved the remaining verses. They came in floods. Each word bled from his body. He did not write with ink. He remembered with pain. When it was done, the mirror turned black. Then cracked. Not shattered, freed. And from it stepped not a person, but a presence. Genderless, ageless, eyes like mirrors reflecting only you. "Will you sing the full truth?" it asked. Thomas did not answer with words. He simply bled. The figure nodded and vanished. He left the cave a final time. Not immortal, not divine, but unafraid, because Thomas now understood something the Crimson Fathers never did. You don't need eternity to be undying. You just need to be remembered honestly, even if it's only in song.
Part 7. The last verse was never written. The Crimson Psalm was complete, but it had never been heard in full. Tomas held it now, not on paper, but in the throb of his pulse, the ache in his bones, the silence between heartbeats. He could speak it, but he hesitated, because the final verse was not words. It was a choice, and choices echo louder than scripture. News traveled. Whispers became rumors. Rumors became fear. The blood-born monk, they called him, the last psalmist, the heretic of memory. Across cities, churches barred their doors. Scholars clutched their relics. But beneath the surface, beneath all the fear, there was a shiver of hope, a quiet, dangerous curiosity. What if he's right? What if the church had gotten it wrong? Tomas arrived in a nameless city at dusk. The cathedral there was older than records, but newer than truth. He did not knock. Doors opened. Inside, hundreds waited, some in robes, some in rags, none speaking. They had not come for salvation. They came to remember. And Tomas, he stood before them, heartbeat steady, not because he knew the ending, but because he had felt the beginning. He raised no hands, no relics, no chalice, only voice. Soft at first, each syllable deliberate,
each pause a sermon. He sang of the first offering, the first betrayal, the first lie turned into law. He sang of blood not as sin, but as story. And the air in the cathedral thickened, not with incense, but with awakening. Then, as he reached the end, the moment when the final verse should have been spoken, he stopped. The silence roared. He looked at them, not above, not beyond, just among. And he whispered, "The last verse is not mine to sing." He stepped back, and the silence waited. A woman stood, then a child, then an old man. And one by one, they began to hum. Not words, but tone. A resonance that vibrated the marrow. A collective truth too ancient for language. The final verse was never meant to be sung by one. It was always meant to be shared. And in that moment, they rewrote history. Not by defiance, but by harmony. Outside, the stars pulsed. The bell in the monastery, centuries away, rang once. Its crack sealed, its memory healed. And the church, in all its grandeur and silence, said nothing, because there was nothing left to suppress. The song was free, and it would never be unheard again.
Part 8. Echoes in the Forbidden. Stories don't end. They dissolve into fog, into prayer, into memory. The tale of Tomas was never truly about immortality. It was about the price of remembrance, about what it costs to feel everything and still keep walking. Long after the cathedral fell quiet, his name became myth, then symbol, then silence again. Some say he vanished into the desert. Others say he returned to the caves to carve verses into stone until his hands forgot their purpose. But there are those who believe that Tomas was never just one man, that he was a rhythm in the human soul, the part that refuses to forget what the world demands we bury. In forbidden texts found in burned-out monasteries, in street songs hummed by children who don't know their source, in the shiver you feel when entering an ancient place, his psalm lingers, not as a warning, not as a prophecy, but as a mirror, one that asks only, "What have you forgotten in order to be accepted?" Because the forbidden is not evil, it is what we were told to fear, only because it could not be controlled. Truth, desire, memory, blood, they are all sacred, and all were once forbidden. So if tonight, as the wind brushes your window, you hear a faint hum, too soft to trace, but too persistent to ignore, do not be afraid. It is not a ghost. It is not a warning. It is the echo of a song that has waited centuries to be remembered by you. Sing it, not with voice, but with courage. And when you do, the forbidden will welcome you home.